So now we're on to season 9. After the previous season, which had the Master in every single serial, this season changes things up by not doing that. Beyond just the lack of the Master, we also have the return of Lewis Marks as the serial's writer, who has not written for the show since Planet of the Giants back at the beginning of season 2, which was a part of the original production block, so a long time ago. But he isn't the only returning name, as an old enemy has returned after a 5-year hiatus. The Daleks have finally returned, and for the first time in colour, so we'll definitely have to talk about that more in detail, as their dramatic return has affected the trajectory of this script. So let's get into the plot. So the plot of this serial is about a group of time-travelling gorillas who have travelled back in time from the 22nd century to the future or the past or the present or all of them depending on when you are. So either way they're going to change time in an attempt to improve the future of Earth. This is a cool idea, and the way it's introduced with one of the gorillas disappearing as he goes to assassinate Reginald Stiles is a great opening to the serial. From here we are introduced to a unit who are tasked with investigating, while at the same time having scenes set in the future which show the world which is seemingly being run by a man called the Controller, but is in fact just a face for the actual rulers. This first episode has plenty of really good hooks, with the idea of time travel being used feeling quite unique for the show, as it really hasn't been touched on in years, probably since the Time Meddler back in season 2. This gives the serial a unique element, which is enhanced as it later goes into paradoxes, which the show hasn't explored at all. I'll discuss these events in more detail later once I've covered the events leading up to them. So to tell it from the perspective of the gorilla's history, in early September of 1972, Reginald Stiles set off a bomb which killed several officials from different countries, which led to a war which weakened Earth and allowed it to be taken over. From there the world would become a dystopian future, where humans are forced to work as slaves with a few exceptions who work for the invaders. The invaders in question being the Daleks, with this somewhat being similar to the invasion in Dalek Invasion of Earth, although in this case it was them taking advantage of a weakened Earth rather than them weakening it themselves. It's kind of cool to see the Daleks return with them already having won, which does make them feel more powerful to a degree. The gorillas reversed engineered the Daleks' time travel technology to go back in time and change the course of history, which is how they encountered the Doctor and Joe, who ended up following them into the future, with them seeing the world for what it is and assisting the gorillas to prevent it. Although there is a twist to this, that being that the gorillas created this future themselves through a paradox. So this is a very cool twist and is totally unique for the show, as mentioned before, and by making it a paradox it basically allows for the Doctor to change history by preventing the explosion without any real worries about creating new paradoxes. The revelation that it is a paradox doesn't occur until towards the end, which does lead to a very rushed attempt to change history. But to explain the paradox, one of the gorillas' plan is to use a Dalekanian bomb to destroy the house and kill Stiles, this being the explosion which caused the war. The final stretch ends up being a race between the Doctor and the Daleks to get to the house first, and prevent the other from interfering. There isn't much to say about the future they're trying to avert, as we only see a small bit of it, but we're mostly focused on the Controller, with the more negative effects mostly off screen, with only a single scene of people carrying buckets full of stone from mining. It's somewhat unfortunate that there isn't really any time spent on this future, as I think it would have made the gorillas' determination to change it feel stronger. Admittedly, this aspect feels a lot like the Dalek Invasion of Earth, with the Daleks turning humanity into slaves, so they can mine for them. Although in this case there isn't a reason given, which means it's probably just for minerals, or maybe they're trying to install the plough with an engine again. This lack of focus on the slaves does hurt the serial a bit, but from a viewer perspective, the fact that the Daleks are ruling is enough, I suppose. So let's talk a bit about the characters in the serial, beginning with the gorillas. So there are only a few of them who are prominent characters, with them being relatively well defined, although I can't remember any of their names. There aren't any personal stakes in the events of the serial for any of them, it's just they're trying to stop the Daleks from ruling the planet, which is fair enough. Although I think that at least one of them should have had a stronger connection to the slavery element of the story, which I think would have enhanced it. The fact that they aren't really singular characters and more a group force does hinder them, but this acts well with the material, and does give some characters great moments. Even if their dynamic with the Doctor is confusing at times, with them going from assuming he Stiles at the beginning to soon preventing him from being killed once they're in the tunnels, this before they know about his relationship with the Daleks. They do eventually side with the Doctor in full and help him escape to the past to prevent Stiles' death, but none of them accompany him, which probably could have helped to make stopping the detonation of the Dalekanian bomb far easier. I will note though that the bomb is still used, but the user sacrifices himself to destroy the Daleks instead, these being the Daleks that follow the Doctor into the past. But given that this changed the future, technically speaking he never made the sacrifice in the first place, so it kind of does take away from the sacrifice from a point of view, but not too much in the grand scheme, as the events still seem to have happened anyway. It's a paradox at the end of the day. Now for the Controller, who's the only notable human outside of the gorillas. So the Controller is a servant of the Daleks, with him being the highest ranked human who oversees the planet for the Daleks, entirely because they are too lazy to do it themselves, even when things go wrong. He's the only one with any sort of backstory, but it isn't anything too interesting, as it's mostly used for him to insist that he is the only person that should be Controller, as it's a role which has been passed down for his family. He's one of those leaders who does terrible things, but insists that he's making things better for people he's ruling over. Although he does ultimately allow for the Doctor and Joe to escape, which leads both to his death and the ultimate change of history. Most of his strength comes from Aubrey Woodger's performance, with him really selling the character more than the dialogue does. Although when watching, I do often find myself distracted by the fact that he's the Candyman from the 1970s version of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Now let's talk about Unit, who are in this serial, but do get sidelined for the middle section, due to that stretch being set in the future. Despite the limited screen time, all of the major players are present, with the Brigadier mostly being in the background at Unit HQ, while Benton and Yates are in charge of guarding the house, which also means they did a terrible job given everything that happened within the first 24 hours of them moving in. Despite their limited screen time, they do still have some great moments, with the Brigadier getting the more serious moments, while Benton and Yates end up with the funnier ones. The most notable funny moment is when Benton asks Joe to sneak him some food, and Yates intercepts it, with this probably being his meanest moment ever as he steals it for himself, with even Joe calling him out on it. When it comes to the final battle, Yates kind of disappears, with Benton being the one in charge, and on the front line, so that's another point for him. So now for Joe, who as expected is strong. By this point the show has really figured out what to do with her traits being a lot more balanced. There are plenty of moments where she is confused about things, but at the same time shows off her independent side, which comes into play when she's alone in the future, although she does take what the controller says at face value, which she might have not have in other serials. Meanwhile, the Doctor is again on point as to be expected at this point, but this serial gives him a new side, his wine drinking side, with him being somewhat of a connoisseur of wine throughout the serial. There are several occasions where he drinks and goes all in on the flavour. This is a bit of a departure from the Doctor we know, who didn't drink at all, although it had been a long time since he was last offered a drink, with being back in Series 3 with the gunfighters. Interestingly, this wine loving side isn't exclusive to this serial and will appear again in this era. Beyond just his drinking habit, having the Doctor facing off against time travellers with a temporal paradox involved, it does mean he gets something unique which we haven't seen with previous incarnations. Although due to the somewhat limited screen time that this paradox gets, it means that the story is somewhat surface level in its approach to it, but the Doctor having to deal with it is still interesting, as we haven't seen it before. One notable thing to talk about with the Doctor in the serial is when he kills Nogron, and I mean that by he point blank shoots it, while it's not even shooting back at him. This is such a weird moment in the serial, which basically everyone has blamed on the director, which makes sense as it's so out of place for the Doctor, at least post early Hartnell. There really is no way to explain this, unless we assume that the Ogrons are such primitive life forms that the Doctor has no qualms about murdering them. So I haven't mentioned the Ogrons up to this point, and that's really for a good reason, because they're not especially interesting. The Ogrons are just servants for the Daleks and the Controller, with them just sort of being around rather than being a species in their own right. They would be easily replaceable with humans who would probably have done a better job given how terrible the Ogrons manage things. Their designs are somewhat cool though, with them being quite minimal, although nothing will ever beat one speaking in two completely different ways sentences apart.
We found and destroyed the enemy.
Any complication?
No complications.
So after putting it off for so long, let's finally talk about the Daleks, who are making their grand return, but it's definitely not them at their best.
You have obtained the space-time coordinates.
So we've got a lot to talk about with them, so let's begin with their disappearance and return. So to talk about this, we have to go all the way back to Mission to the Unknown and the Daleks' master plan, as it was during the production of these serials that Terry Nation was interested and attempted to create a Dalek spin-off, which would be separate from the Doctor Who universe. Now this of course didn't work out, but the lengthy process to try and sort the rights to the Daleks merchandising both allowed for the BBC to make evil of the Daleks, while also creating some tension between Nation and the BBC. Combining that with the end of Dalek Mania and no more Dalek serials were commissioned. Now there was an idea to pair them up with the Cybermen, but Nation didn't want his creations being overshadowed by another villain, and so we got Wheel in Space instead. But this led to the Daleks not appearing in a full serial until now, with producer Barry Letts finally approaching Nation to bring them back. That's the out-of-universe explanation as to their disappearance, but in universe their return is just something which happens. Despite the last time we saw them, they were in the middle of a civil war, which seemingly led to their final end, although there was a hint of one surviving. Day of the Daleks doesn't address any of this, which is understandable given the time this was made in. But as a fan, it's kind of weird that they just show up again as if nothing happened. But as it turns out, there originally was a scene in which this was addressed, but it was edited out of the final programme, which means that this scene is lost. But at one point existed, and presumably the dialogue still exists in script form, so I would be very interested in finding out what exactly was discussed. Now I called it a disappearance, but in a way, the Daleks never really left the show, with them making an appearance in every season except for season 7 in some way. Season 5 featured them with a short clip of Evil of the Daleks being used at the end of Wheel in Space. They made a cameo in the War Games, and then in season 8 there was a Dalek featured in the Doctor's torture, in the Mind of Evil. So on the Daleks themselves in this serial, as I before said, it's not their best. Ignoring the voices, which were a choice which the director regretted.
Doctor, did you say Doctor?
They don't do anything except sit around and talk. This does somewhat fit the Daleks with them acting in the background, but they don't move around until the final battle, with every other scene featuring them in a single position, maybe wobbling from side to side while they chant. The story really doesn't expand on them either, with their presence basically being them repeating the Dalek invasion of Earth, but far less interestingly. There's also the problem of the number of Daleks involved in this serial, with the direction making it clear that there are only 3 props at this point, with the exception of one scene and their entrance into the final battle. So by this point the BBC had only 3 Dalek props left, as most had been junked during their break from the show, which which while a small number was only one less than most Dalek serials up to this point had used. But the serial doesn't spend time making you think there are more than just these three. There are those two shots I mentioned, one of which featuring the destruction of one of the Daleks and the other being the opening scene of their attack, where it appears there are more Daleks. But after the initial shots of their arrival, it's just the three of them. The real lack of presence with the Daleks really hurts them, as they don't feel like the threat they usually are. Although this serial does introduce us to the Gold Dalek as a replacement for the Black Dalek rank, while the rest of the Daleks are now a dark grey instead of the bright silver colour. So let's talk about the writing process and how the Daleks came to be written into a script by someone other than Nation again. So initially Barry Letts wanted the Daleks to return and they were planned to appear in the season finale in their own serial, The Daleks in London. But the decision was later made to open the season with them, and so they were bolted into Lewis Mark's story, which is basically the same story, but the controller presumably would have actually been evil, while the Daleks wouldn't have been involved at all. And this backstory to the script does explain why the Daleks are just sort of around, mostly in the background, because they had to be fitted into the story that already existed. So the Daleks being added to this serial really doesn't add anything to this story, as the premise itself of having essentially ghosts from the future coming to kill someone is definitely interesting enough, and so I think the Daleks being left out of this serial would have improved it considerably. With that covered, let's address the production issues with this serial, as anyone who has watched it will have noticed some very notable problems with its direction, most notably the reuse of the Doctor Who sting after the recaps. So this occurred because the director who hadn't worked on the show before thought that this was a part of the show's style, which is why it's present. Although I have to admit that it does somewhat feel like an attempt to recreate the style which introduced the sting back in the Ambassadors of Death. And since we're talking about the sting and therefore the ending credits, another big technical issue is when the background of the credits was put on the CSO layer, while the text was put on top, meaning that we briefly get Pertwee's credit on top of the Dalek, which looks so weird and feels very American. Now there are a few other issues throughout this serial, with the serial feeling a lot sloppier than the serials we've been seeing recently. But the final thing I want to note is the cutting of a scene, which while technically not a production issue, caused somewhat of a plot problem. So I did mention a cut scene before, but this one wasn't even recorded, because the director thought it was unnecessary, and that's the original ending, which would have followed up an earlier scene where the Doctor and Jo see their future selves. The serial does end on a good enough note, but the removal of this scene really makes that earlier scene feel incomplete, which makes it feel completely pointless in the grand scheme of things. Finally, we have the colorisation, which I really should start calling the restoration at this point, as we're getting to an era where most of the serials are being restored rather than colorised. So on the restoration, this will be brief because for the first time the entire serial exists in full colour, with every episode existing in the form of its original 2-inch master tape. Okay, yes, Spearhead is the first to fully exist in colour, but that was on film, while this is videotape, which up to this point we've only had a few episodes here and there. So Day of the Daleks is a serial with a lot of baggage. It sees the return of the Daleks after their extended break, alongside being the first time that the show approached paradoxes. But ultimately, due to a combination of the Daleks being added and some lazy direction, the end result isn't very good. It's a serial which would have been far better if the Daleks hadn't been a part of it, as their presence really doesn't serve any purpose within the story. At the very least, despite all its problems, it did bring the Daleks back after their extended absence, and for all its faults, at the very least it wasn't cut down to 3 episodes like with Lewis Mark's previous script. But with the Daleks dealt with, the Doctor and Jo leave Earth behind, as they make a trip to the planet Peladon, which is preparing to join the Federation. But all is not happy, as an ancient curse threatens the potential alliance, and an old enemy of the Doctor may stand in the way of peace. Next time, the Curse of Peladon.